the contents of their deliberations are sealed for 50 years. They sign non-disclosure agreements, the committee members, but trying to be a bit more transparent, clearly, in this interview and elsewhere, about the process by which this is awarded, and to try and protect the integrity of the prize in circumstances where it is being denigrated very regularly by the President of the United States and his allies.
Lara Spirit is our woman in the corridors of power. Hello, Lara.
Hi, Hugo.
Good to have you with us. Let's talk about Iran. Nuclear talks between the US and Iran have begun in Geneva today, a day after Tehran launched military drills in the Strait of Hormuz. Here's Donald Trump speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One ahead of negotiations.
So I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important, and we'll see what can happen. I mean, it's been typically Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators, or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators, because we could have had a deal instead of sending the B-2s in to knock out their nuclear potential, and we had to send the B-2s. I hope they're going to be more reasonable.
Well, he's going to be represented by his son-in-law Jared Kushner and the US envoy Steve Witkoff as well. So, Lara, they're good negotiators, but also bad negotiators. But one thing we know for sure is they're not negotiators in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it will be very interesting to see what comes out of these negotiations. Of course, we are at a point where it remains very difficult to know what President Trump is thinking. There's been the suggestion, of course, that he favors a diplomatic solution, all the while building up, of course, a huge amount of military capabilities in the Middle East, including another group of 18 535 fighter jets that arrived on Monday. So all of these options still remain open. These talks remain vital. They got off, I mean, in some respects, there was a bit of a choppy start because we had demands from Iran to change the location of a last meeting, and also to kind of narrow the scope of the topics that were being discussed, wanting them focused on nuclear issues, but not, for example, those protests that had engulfed the country and the Iranian regime in recent weeks. And so in the end, of course, the US, pressured by other Middle Eastern countries who do want to see progress on a diplomatic solution here, to push forward with this. But it is fair to say that it is quite a precarious process at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that Trump is a fan of, well, brinkmanship, I suppose we'd call it. But I mean, he's been building up military assets in the region for some time. He talks about them an awful lot, whether they're an armada or whatever they are. He keeps mentioning them. Is he in danger of looking a bit politically foolish and weak if either he doesn't get some kind of truly impressive deal out of Iran, or he doesn't go to war?
I guess that's the question, is what level of a diplomatic win will Trump need to be able to turn around to those who do want to see him strike Iran and to push forward with some military solution to this question, and say, actually, I'm not going to do this. And for that to not be an exercise that would lose him some aspect of respect or faith. So I think you're right. That's a very interesting question. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see what the final terms, if any, of a deal that these negotiators that are speaking in Geneva today reach.
Is there any pushback from his own side, from the MAGA coalition, to the extent it is one, about what sounds like kind of warmongering? Because they do sort of pride themselves on being the not war guys, don't they?
Yes, although, of course, what we've seen, I think, in the past year very clearly is that when it comes to this doctrine of America first, it is very much what President Trump determines it to be with regard to his base. And I think the last round of those strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in June are very instructive in illustrating that point. We did see some murmurings from those in the MAGA base at the time who were uncomfortable, who were nervous about a possible fallout from this. That was pretty short-lived. Even those who were very vociferously opposed to this did not make it a kind of fundamental schism or issue on which they were willing to really go to battle with the Trump administration on. And insofar as that was seen as a discrete operation that Trump said, was capable of obliterating their nuclear capabilities, there was, less risk or indeed reason for some of these people to eventually come on side. Of course, there'll be some nervousness about whether or not this will be different. And I think we'll have to see, with that regard. But I think Trump's support base has remained very solid, even on this question of international affairs.
Okay, time now, Lara, for the most Trumpian moment of the week.
Thank you very much. This is truly one of the great honors of my life.
So, cast your minds back a month or so to when the president's very angry private text to the Norwegian Prime Minister were leaked. Trump was expressing his frustration at not being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, now in a new interview, Norway's leader has publicly voiced his thoughts for the first time. What's he said, Lara?
Yes, so very interestingly, he sat down with the Atlantic magazine on the fringes of the Munich Security Conference last week and spoke about that extraordinary text exchange that you'll remember, which was in the midst of that very tense moment when Trump was threatening to acquire Greenland, where there hadn't been the use of force ruled out yet, even, and where European allies in particular were getting extremely nervous. And in that moment, we had a text from Norway's leader, Jonas Gahr Store, and of course, the Prime Minister of Finland, Alexander Stubb, the president, sorry, who of course we know is an ally of President Trump, who Trump likes very much. And they text him a joint text, basically asking to de-escalate the situation and to talk with each other about the current questions. And you'll remember there was this text reply from Trump where he said, "Dear Jonas, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." In other words, Trump was explicitly linking his designs on Greenland, which is, of course, a Danish territory, to that failure to secure the Nobel Peace Prize, which, of course, he was overlooked in his quest for that last year. Quite at that point, a very significant moment, I think, for everybody that was watching this Greenland situation closely. And Norway's Prime Minister has not spoken at length about that exchange previously. And he's saying most recently to The Atlantic that he has tried many times to remind him that it's not his decision. It's actually the government's decision. He doesn't have anything to do with it. It's an independent committee. It's staunchly independent. And he said he doesn't listen on that frequency when he was asked whether Trump still accepts that explanation. Interestingly, in that interview as well, we heard from the director of the Nobel Institute, Christian Berg-Harpfegen, who said that the campaign by Trump and his allies for the prize, actually, interestingly, would neither help nor hinder his cause. He said a candidate who is aggressively campaigning for him or herself will neither be penalised nor privileged. We are very conscious about that. And I think this is an interesting interview because, of course, that this process by which they award the prize has come under an enormous amount of scrutiny. Trump has made it a very, very big part of his argument recently, saying basically that this committee was wrong to not award it to him, citing, for example, his decision to award the prize to Obama in 2009, not very long into his own administration, as evidence for why this process is deeply unfair. And the Norwegians, particularly in this committee, are having to go on in something of a rearguard action to justify their own choices. But I think it's very rare, given how secretive they are. And actually, in this interview, Hartford doesn't even refer to Trump directly. He just talks to him as the candidate in question. They are clearly trying to balance a situation where they're under a huge amount of scrutiny. And of course, they've been under scrutiny before, but a huge amount of renewed scrutiny, probably the most that they've had over this question about whether or not Trump will at some point get a prize, while also being a very secretive by nature organization. The contents of their deliberations are sealed for 50 years. They sign non-disclosure agreements, the committee members, but trying to be a bit more transparent, clearly in this interview and elsewhere, about the process by which this is awarded and to try and protect the integrity of the prize in circumstances where it is being denigrated very regularly by the President of the United States and his allies.
Hey, at least he can call himself a candidate. That's something. Finally, Lara, it's time for Westminster versus Washington, two places at the beating heart of democracy, with Lara, of course, being experienced in both. But which is best? Today, we're going to compare the commuting. So, Lara, what's your commute like in DC?
I have to say my commute here is heavenly. There's no ambiguity about who wins this one because it's about a 5-minute cycle for me to get into work in Washington, DC, which is obviously unthinkable in London. I haven't smelt a sweaty armpit in as many months since I've been here, which has been just the most pleasant escape ever. And it's a very commutable and very convenient place. And when you speak to a number of Europeans here, they'll often say, who might be critical, for example, of the stereotype of Americans who will always drive to the office, for example. Cars, as anyone will know, very big and very beloved thing in the US. They will say, actually, Washington is probably the most European American city as they come. We have a very functional metro and bus system here. And people are, very fond of commuting in ways that you often see in Europe. So I think it is a great city for commuting. It's very walkable and it's very convenient.
If your London was worse, isn't that your fault for where you lived? You could have lived in, boring Pimlico like everyone in Westminster used to, couldn't you have done?
I've lived in Pimlico. I mean, I think that if you look at the average commuting times in London, they will be much longer than for many people in Washington. I'm pretty sure that most people in London will commute. I mean, we could have had this information ready for this, but I'm pretty sure people in London will commute for more than 30 or even 40 minutes to get to work in the morning. Would you not think? I mean,
Yeah,
I think that's
I would have thought so. I would have thought so because they can't afford to live next to Parliament anymore. Look, would you rather sit on the tube or on the metro? Which is better?
I'd rather sit on the metro.
Oh dear.
Because you usually do often get a seat. So
Lara Spirit, you're breaking my heart.
sorry.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
No, thanks as always. Look, it's always an education. Thanks for being with us. That is Lara Spirit there speaking from Washington. Good to speak to you as always, Lara.